Our next speaker is Dr. Ramakrishnan Sitaraman, and he would be speaking on Sitaram Goel's conclusion on iconoclasm and theology in context of non-Indian history. As we saw yesterday, he has a doctorate in microbiology and is a keen student of Indian and world history. So I request Dr. Ramakrishnan to present his views on the topic.
Okay, thank you. But before I start, I want to know from you and Dr. Elst, how much time we have, because it's almost 1 o'clock here. So do we shift everything by 1 hour? I mean, very simply.
Yeah, we can do that. I'm in no hurry. I mean, I don't know about the others, but as far as I'm concerned, your topic is important enough. So we should devote some
we
time.
are perfectly. Yeah, I'm perfectly all right. So whatever time you can take, I'm totally okay by me.
Okay, so I'll try to stay within my previously allotted time, 1 hour or so. So that is what I'm going to do.
Yes, sir.
And in fact, this discussion has raised some questions which I'll try to answer, impromptu in the course of my talk also. So thank you. It's a privilege for me to present my ideas or, extension of Sri Sitaram Goelji's ideas on the occasion of his centenary. This is a very important event that has happened, and this kind of discussion not to take place. And my topic specifically is not about the challenge of Islam per se, but about his conclusions on iconoclasm and theology, but in the context of non-Indian history. As you all know, Sri Sitaram Goel wrote about Indian temples and so on. But I want to extend this argument, especially in the light of counter arguments that have come up since. So, of course, the regular disclaimer is that all these views are personal. That's necessary to say. So the point of departure here is Sri Sitaram Goel's own writing in his famous book Hindu Temples: What Happened to Them, chapter 9. He said that he made this correlation between theology and actual action and behavior. So he said, it is inconceivable that a constant and consistent behavior pattern, witnessed for a long time and over a vast area, can be explained except in terms of a settled system of belief. This is very important. A settled system of belief which leaves no scope for second thoughts. So when you look at the large number of temples that have been destroyed and turned into Muslim monuments, he says that do not try to come up with economic and political explanations. These attempts can only be futile, if not a fraudulent exercise. These are his words. And the problem is that these economic or political explanations are not even plausible. This is what he said in his time when he wrote that book, Hindu Temples: What Happened to Them. So now this created, if you are aware of history, this creates a question in my mind as to when Sri Sitaram Goel was such a talented person, he was so knowledgeable and everything, did he even have to spend time to make this statement? And the reason is as follows. Because the statement that he has made is actually only a restatement in some way, mutatis mutandis, of a 2,000-year-old consensus which has been applied to a local context. As we saw yesterday, the first two commandments are very clear: no other gods before me, and secondly, you shall not make any idols. So the injunction against polytheism and idolatry has been acknowledged by the prophetic monotheistic religions themselves. So why is it that people need to suddenly come up with economic, political, and all sorts of other explanations is the question. And why did Sri Sitaramji have to expend so much energy and time and resources to come up with this compilation at all? And part of the reason is that in India, things moved in a different way. Even before independence, there was this element of negationism where everything was blamed on the British. All Hindu-Muslim conflict was blamed on the British. The British policy of divide and rule, the British blamed for the partition also. And it became a article of faith in our textbooks also. So if you look at any school textbooks, they will say that Hindus and Muslims were living happily together, and these bad British people came and destroyed this equilibrium. Now, this was this kind of negationism has deep roots. It has nothing to do with modern scholars trying to obfuscate it, though that is also part of the reason. Now, after Sri Sitaram Goel published this list of temples, and he also analyzed the theological motivation behind temple destruction, Professor Richard Eaton wrote 2 long articles in Frontline. These were titled Temple Desecration in Pre-Modern India and Temple Desecration and Indo-Muslim States. This is important because Professor Richard Eaton had also written a book much earlier, before Sri Sitaram Goel wrote his book on Hindu temples. He had written on the Sufis of Bijapur, and that was a standard book, and it also refers to incidents of temple destruction. And I think some of those have actually been referred to by Sri Goel himself. I'll have to look carefully, but maybe he has. But in other words, Professor Eaton's previous work was unexceptionable, and it was pretty much what the consensus is, historical consensus. Now, in these 2 articles, Richard Eaton insisted on seeing some kind of continuity in the practice of temple destruction by citing a few pre-Islamic instances of Hindu kings carrying away statues after raiding temples. So, in other words, what is happening in this Indian subcontinent is nothing more than a continuation of what kings usually do. The kings can be Hindu, the kings can be Muslim, they can be whatever, but carrying away statues and raiding temples is what kings usually do during a conquest. This was the thesis that was put forward, at least the way I understand it. But what was not pointed out was that the fate of the statues taken away by Hindu kings was radically different from the fate these statues met in Islamic dispensations. So if the Hindu king takes away a statue, most probably he's going to put it up in his own temple, private temple or public one, whatever, and then worship it in a grander way. Whereas in the Islamic case, there is not even one instance where any statue has been taken and then worshipped in a better way or equivalent way. And Dr. Conrad Elst characterized these arguments as a form of historical negationism. And again, he highlighted the role of theology in iconoclasm. He said this is one of the titles of his articles was Iconoclasm Sanctified by Scripture, if I remember it right. So he again reiterated that link, and he also wrote a separate book on negationism in India. And he pointed out the scale of destruction and contrasted the ultimate fate of statues and idols, just as we do. So now the related question that came to my mind is about this cultural continuity. Based on this postulate of cultural continuity, is iconoclasm a continuation of cultural practices in the Middle East, the original home of the prophetic monotheistic religions? This is the question that came to my mind, because when a group of people go to some new country, they can be refugees, they can be invaders, they can be anything in between, that doesn't matter. There are certain kinds of cultural adjustments that do happen. One is that a certain amount of assimilation occurs. In effect, people take up the language of the country that they have come to. That can happen. You can see it in the case of gypsies who are all over Europe and they speak the local language. On the other hand, they can also try to preserve some elements of their own culture. For instance, they can have names the way they used to and not assimilate with the local naming methods. Or if you see many Indian immigrant communities all over the world, you see that they try to have their local Hindu temple and local community associations, and they celebrate certain cultural elements. They have language classes. So when one group goes from one region, from its native region to an alien region, it can do one of two things. It can do two things, actually. These are not mutually exclusive. It can borrow, it can assimilate, and it can also try to retain some of its cultural norms. So my question now is, when these Islamic invaders came to India, were they actually maintaining the cultural continuity that was there in the native land of prophetic monotheism, which is the Middle East? Though these were Turkic invaders, clearly as Islam comes from the Middle East and it converts the Turks, now do the Turkic invaders actually convey this cultural continuity from the Middle East into India is the question. Now, I don't know, I put this without knowing what would happen, but it seems to be sort of relevant. because this is the criticism of the world's first Indologist, Al-Biruni, about Hindus. He says that Hindus believe there is no country but theirs, no nation like theirs, no kings like theirs, no religion like theirs, no science like theirs. They're 40 foolishly vain, self-conceited and stolid, and so on and so forth. And they are sort of hostile. And he advises them, if they traveled and mixed with other nations, they would soon change their mind. And he also gives some mitigating circumstances. For their ancestors were not as narrow-minded as the present generation is. This was 1,000 years ago. Now, the context is that Al-Biruni came in the wake of Mahmud of Ghaznavi. So all the Hindus pretty much were angry with the so-called foreigner. They didn't really parse it out very carefully. So they seem to have been pretty narrow-minded in that sense. So, but anyway, we don't want to be narrow-minded and keep confining ourselves to India. So that is why we want to look at some non-Indian history. So to find out whether some of these practices are imports from the native lands of prophetic monotheism. So the area that I'm going to talk about, can you see my cursor? No, you can't see my cursor. Anyway, the area that I'm going to talk about in this map is roughly from modern Iraq, which would be Mesopotamia, all the way going leftward to Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Amman, Jordan, and Egypt, and all the way down to Sudan. Because Egypt, south of Egypt, what is now Sudan, was also the kingdom of Nubia, which will feature in our talk later. And of course, you have Iraq, which is Mesopotamia, and you have the Near East. We will not go into Anatolia, but Anatolia will figure peripherally, or indirectly. So this is the area, and this is where I want to find out whether there are some cultural continuity between those practices and these. So in search of continuity, we go to Mesopotamia. Now consider the Semitic-speaking Assyrian Empire in Mesopotamia. So this is the Bronze Age Empire. And interestingly, here we hit pay dirt because there are documented instances of Assyrian kings who capture the statues of gods of other cities, hostile kingdoms, and so on. And they destroy them. They deport them along with the people that they are deporting. So the Assyrian kingdom was pretty much warlike. It was extremely warlike, and probably a Bronze Age equivalent of Genghis Khan. I don't know, maybe that is carrying it too far, but they were pretty brutal in punishing rebellious peoples or enemy kingdoms. So they would take away the gods and statues of gods, either destroy them, deport them, or they would do another thing. They would take these statues of gods and put them as doorkeepers in Assyrian temples. So in other words, the god has been demoted to becoming a Dwarapal, as we would say in Sanskrit. So I found this interesting paper by Shana Zaya called State-Sponsored Sacrilege, God-Napping and Omission in Neo-Assyrian Inscriptions, which is published. You can see the reference. So she has taken a very different view, and I think a refreshingly different view from what most modern secularist historians do. You see, most modern secularist historians are obviously discarded religion as a factor in their personal lives. But many of them make this mistake of assuming that it must apply likewise to the people they study, whether ancient or contemporary. That is not true. There are people who keep, theology and religion above economics and politics. There are still human beings of that sort also. And so trying to reduce everything to economic or political explanation, which was criticized by Sri Sitaram Goel, again applies to these people. So there are many papers in which they will say that Assyrian kings did this because they wanted to show political power or political might or favor some vassal and this and that. But they were also religious people, and they venerated these gods just as much as the next man. So why can't we grant them that religious feeling and that intensity of religious feeling, that sincerity of religious feeling? So let us just look at them in their own way, on their own terms. So that is the reason this particular paper really caught my eye. So what she has done painstakingly is that she documented 56 instances where Assyrian kings had done these things during the course of war. There are 56 instances in which these things have happened, but only 7 of them seem to include the names of the actual gods that they so desecrated or destroyed or deported or demoted, they are sort of reluctant to mention the names. They might say, oh, the gods of such and such kingdom. They might say the gods of such and such city, or they might say the gods of such and such people or tribe, but they are reluctant to include the names of the gods that they have subjected to such ill treatment. On the other hand, the same Assyrian kings also restored statues and temples to various cities, ostensibly to highlight continuity in rulership and reassure the conqueror. So this is the political part of it. But again, when you look at the actual instances, you find 22 instances of such restoration. And in 18 instances, they are proudly naming all the gods. They have no problem. So clearly, they are very happy to take credit when they are doing something meritorious, like restoring the worship of a god, restoring a temple, or restoring the statue of a god that had been taken away earlier back to the original city and back to the original people. So this is what has happened. And in the latter case, where they are restoring things, they are very happy to name the gods so that they can probably get some punya or merit in the hereafter. Assyrian treaties also recognize the gods of other people and invoke formulaic curses on violators. And this we saw yesterday, because you have these translations of what god should be used in which treaty, and what gods are equivalent. The people of that area, Mesopotamia and Near East, have gone into some trouble to recognize what equivalents we have in other cultures. So this is also a feature of Middle East. And the conclusion of that paper is that the scribes are generally reluctant to mention desecration. And they are very reluctant to even mention the desecration in the name of a particular king. So desecration is clearly an act of revenge, of anger, of something. It can be symptomatic of everything, but it is not a symptom of piety in the Assyrian scheme of things. However, the restoration is unequivocally an act of piety. So that shows that the king is so pious, and so on and so forth. The first one, they are not very sure. They'd rather not talk about it, because you see, they do not think the other gods are false. This is a very important point. So it might invoke the wrath of the other gods who are not false, who are merely not your gods, but they are not false. Now, this is Assyria. In the next part of the continuity, we go to Egypt, which is, of course, the cradle of monotheism, as we saw yesterday. So there is an incident in which Kushites from Nubia, that is from Sudan, they raided Egypt during Roman times. And they carried away statues of the Emperor Augustus. As we said earlier, these statues are probably erected as a symbol of the Roman conquest, where you had to sacrifice to the genius of the emperor. And so the Kushites understand that symbolism. They are at war with Roman Egypt. So they raid Egypt and carry away these statues of Emperor Augustus. And that's not all. One of these statues was decapitated, and the head of the statue was buried face downward in a temple at Meroe, which is a major site of the kingdom of Kush, of Nubia. And it was discovered in 1910. So they were capable of doing this kind of desecration to a statue of some adversary. But then the same Kushites had also ruled Egypt much earlier as the 25th dynasty of pharaohs. And in that case, there are no instances of anti-Egyptian iconoclasm. So the Kushites did this as a one-off thing, where they are at war with Roman Egypt, and they are trying to, they seem to have avoided all the Egyptian gods, but they have taken this Augustus statue and then given it some harsh treatment. And finally, after Alexander's conquest, the Greek Ptolemaic dynasty also ruled as per the pharaonic norms. And in fact, Cleopatra was married to her own younger brother Ptolemy. Okay. So this is a matter of recorded history. So we are looking for iconoclasm. Just to remind you, we are looking for a continuity in iconoclasm in the Middle East. And now we come to the Hebrews, and we are getting into the Bible. One of the things that biblical scholarship has revealed is that the covenant of God with Hebrews follows templates that were prevalent in the ancient Middle East, Assyrian, Hittite, Syrian templates that were prevalent in the ancient Middle East. And, I have given 2 references for this, but this is insufficient because there's a huge amount of work that has been done on, word by word analysis of the Bible. And I'm obviously not competent to go into all of that. All I can do is apologize to all the scholars whose work I have not cited. Okay. But certain things are very clear. There are two types of covenants that are prevalent in the ancient Middle East. First is the Promissory Covenant, which is unconditional. So somebody is going to do something for someone else without any conditions. So it could be a king saying that I protect you, regardless, because you are my subject. So that could be a promissory covenant. The other type of covenant is the obligatory type of covenant, where the discharge of the superior person's obligations is conditional on the subordinate person observing certain norms. So we'll come to that in detail. So these are the two types of covenants. One form of obligatory covenant used in international relations is the suzerain vassal type. That is between the Chakravarti and the Raja in our terms. So the emperor and the king would be the vassal of the emperor. So one party is distinctly superior to the other. The suzerain will discharge duties towards the vassal. There is no doubt about that. They have to protect them and so on and so forth, provided the vassal remains obedient and loyal. So what is required of the vassal is obedience and loyalty. If they are required to send so much of tribute, they got to send it on time. They got to supply so many horses and so many men. They have to supply those things on time and in the correct way. So contingent on all this good behavior, the suzerain will discharge duties towards the vassal. And this is very important because the covenant of God with the Hebrews follows this kind of suzerain vassal template. This is an important finding. And especially the part where the suzerain will discharge his duties towards a vassal only if the vassal remains obedient and loyal. So this explains a lot of the biblical narrative, because obviously the Hebrews are in many wars with many people. There's a lot of conflict, there's no doubt about that. So in some of these conflicts they win, in some of the conflicts they lose. And I would like to direct your attention towards the conflicts that are lost by the Hebrews. So whenever the Hebrews lose the conflict, the prophets immediately arise among them and they tell them that you lost because you were not loyal to the Lord. In other words, what they might have done is they might have been worshipping, but like Solomon, they must have gone and worshipped Chemosh or some other god. And so, it's like a vassal professing loyalty to two kings, which obviously cannot be done. So the prophets interpret the defeat as being a consequence of disobedience and disloyalty. And therefore they say, once you set aside all these other polytheistic elements and go back to the worship of your true Lord, only then will the Lord start to discharge his duty of protecting you and making you victorious. So it explains a lot of biblical narrative. Now we come to a very specific incident, which is again part of the biblical narrative, which is the promised land and the Philistine captivity of the Ark of the Covenant. So let us explain these terms. What is the Ark of the Covenant? The Hebrews carried the stone tablets containing the canonical 10 commandments in what may be considered a mobile shrine. So this is described in great detail in the book of Exodus. And God tells them that how to make this mobile shrine. Okay. And the tablets on which the 10 commandments are inscribed, the stone tablets, are actually kept inside this mobile shrine, and they are carried around with the Jews wherever they go. Now, again, I'm not going to assign a BC date or an AD date to all these happenings, because this is not strictly history as it happened, but history as it is remembered and made into a narrative. Jan Asman, whom we referred to yesterday, refers to this as mnemo history, that is history as it is remembered. So the Hebrews carried around their 10 commandments in the form of an ark, and it is sort of an improvised shrine. It is a sort of improvised shrine. Now, the Philistine captivity of the Ark of the Covenant is an incident I have chosen among all the other incidents of iconoclasm for a particular reason. Yes, the biblical narrative is full of iconoclasm, no problem. But this particular incident describes not only the religious attitudes of the iconoclasts, but also describes in great details the attitudes of the idolaters. This is where this Philistine captivity of the ark gains some importance. So this is an artist's rendering. I mean, since it's about iconoclasm, I had to show at least one statue. So you can see that the Jews are carrying this shrine in which the Ark of the Covenant, in which the tablets are placed, and you can even see the two cherubim on top of the casket, where they are shading this casket with their wings. And this is exactly as per the instructions given in Exodus 20, book 25, 10 to 22. So this is from one of the cathedrals in France. So now what happens in the Promised Land when the Philistines capture the Ark of the Covenant? So the scene is that in the first book of Samuel, the Hebrews are fighting with the Philistines, and they are losing also. So since they are losing, the Philistines seem to come to war with the statues of their gods. So the Hebrews suggest that they also take out the Ark of the Covenant and bring it to the front lines. Okay, because if their gods are supporting them, why can't we get our God to support us? This is a very simple logic. However, what happens is the Philistines win, and as war booty, they capture the Ark, but they do not destroy it. They keep it in the shrine of their own god Dagon at a city called Ashdod. So this Ark, even though it is captured, it is not desecrated, it is not destroyed, it is kept in a temple. So it's kept in a good place. Now they keep it, go back home, and after day one, they find that Dagon's statue is found face down. So they say, okay, something must have happened, never mind. They set it upright, and then they go back about their business. On day two, the same thing happens. Dagon's statue has fallen down, the head and hands are broken, and the broken hands and head are found on the threshold of the temple. So the Philistines take this, very badly, and they feel very sad about it. So the Bible informs us that the Philistines subsequently abstain from treading the threshold of Dagon's temple. So they don't want to put their foot on a place where, parts of their God statue had lain. So they are very careful. I mean, they don't like this kind of iconoclasm. It's very clear. And probably they were trying to, this is purely my guess, they were trying to see if the Lord of the Hebrews could be brought over to their side. They were probably trying to propitiate the Lord of the Hebrews. But unfortunately, this doesn't stop there. There is a sudden invasion of mice. So after these people bring the Ark of the Covenant, there is a sudden invasion of mice. There is the outbreak of tumors or some kind of disease that causes boils. I'm guessing it's plague, because plague also causes buboes. But anyway, because of this, these problems, priests are consulted. However, I wish to draw your attention to this, which seems to be a mini case of the 10 plagues of Egypt. Because in the case of Egypt also, the Lord brings 10 plagues on the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh relents only at the 10th. So priests are consulted to see what can be happened. That is, the priests of the Philistines are consulted to find out what could be done to avert these calamities. So they suggest transferring the ark to a city called Gath. And then subsequently, they try to transfer it to another city called Ekron. Why? Because the same story is repeated over 7 months in both cities. The same story is repeated over 7 months in both cities. The same mice come out, say people break out in boils, and all these problems happen. Now again, the priests are wondering where we are going wrong. They want to first do it very systematically according to their theology. They want to check if the capture of the ark is responsible for all these calamities. They suggest sending the ark back to the Hebrews with guilt offerings. This is very important. Guilt offerings, which consist of 5 golden tumors and 5 golden mice. and these things are kept in a cart. The ark is kept in a cart drawn by 2 cows, and along with these guilt offerings. The stipulation, according to their system of belief, is that if the ark is not causing all these miseries, then it would not go into Israelite territory. On the other hand, if the ark was causing all these problems as a hostile act, it would go back into Israelite territory. And as it happened, the story ends when the cart came to a stop in a Hebrew's field. So clearly, this was the Lord exercising his powers against the enemies of the Hebrews. So again, another picture, the ark sent away by Philistines. So it was kept in a cart like this, probably, and sent away. Now, some observations and comments. First of all, since this is a biblical narrative, this account is provided by hostile witnesses, that is, hostile to Philistines. But it shows that Philistines do not desecrate their rivals' divine symbol, but try to co-opt it for themselves. Okay. And when they send these guilt offerings, the Philistines seem to implicitly recognize that separating a god from his people is sort of wrong. And this goes back to the Assyrian thing. They are reluctant to say that we took away such and such god, and all that reluctance is again manifested in this different form, because they send them back with the guilt offerings. The Philistine norms ensure the safe return of the ark. On the other hand, the Hebrew norms suggest the symbolism of the broken statue of Dagon. You see, the first day, second day, the ark is kept. First day, the ark is kept in the temple. Dagon falls down, and the second day, the statue is righted, and the ark is left there. The second day, the statue of Dagon is broken. So the symbolism of iconoclasm is there. So these are the two different norms coexisting in the same area, which is the ancient Middle East. And the reason we had to do this excursion to the Bible is also because Goelji traces Islamic iconoclasm directly to the Bible. Because as Dr. Elst pointed out, he took those biblical narratives and whatever research was done at his time at face value. So if this is the biblical narrative and this is the outcome that we are going to have. Again, from the same book, Hindu Temples, What Happened. And more importantly, the Quran itself goes into some lengths to suggest that Abraham was an iconoclast in his own tribe. Though this account of Abraham as an iconoclast does not appear in the Bible, the Quran has dedicated nearly 20 verses to this fact, at least the Quran as we know it. And there is an incident in the early Islamic history where a person named Khalid destroys the temple of Al-Uzza. This is also noted by Goelji, by the way. So the Islamic warrior Khalid goes and destroys the temple of Al-Uzza, who is one of the goddesses of the ancient Arabs. And the priest is helpless to do anything. So he prays to Al-Uzza, and he says as follows. He says, Al-Uzza, either you make an attack on Khalid and destroy him, and if you can't save yourself, at least become a Christian. So this is what the pre-Islamic Arabic priest says, tells his goddess, see, either you protect yourself or you quickly become a Christian, which means that he understood that iconoclasm was somehow normative for Christians because they were more familiar with Christians in Arabia. Now, what has been done is just as important as what is not done. That is the other part of this entire story. So the hostile witness, Khafi Khan, who was a historian at the court of Aurangzeb, cannot cite even one example of wanton mosque destruction by Shivaji, who was the deadly adversary of the Mughal Empire. And this is from, old records. Now, we come to the contemporary times. So many people are saying, getting very happy about the destruction of the Babri Mosque, but they are not. They are giving any number of reasons. They are saying that they have taken revenge. This is justice, or serves them right. people say all sorts of things, but what they are not doing is they are not citing Professor Eaton to affirm that this is our subcontinental practice, that it is our subcontinental game to, keep breaking each other's place of worship. So, and neither can they find anything to cite in their own theology. And likewise, they cannot find anything to cite in their own history, as Goelji again pointed out in his writings. Because he actually prepared a questionnaire for Marxist professors, and he said, please tell us which are the Buddhist monuments that were destroyed, which are the Hindu monuments sitting on the site of Buddhist monuments, show us the epigraphic evidence, show us all the historians who have applauded the kings for doing this kind of destroying the Buddhist monument, and so on and so forth. So he set up a full questionnaire for the Marxist professors who insisted that this was part of practice and Hindus have done it too. Now, this is the kind of continuity that we should be seeing. So nobody from ancient times can find any justification among Hindus for iconoclasm. That is continuity. What is worse, the much maligned Manusmriti also doesn't help us in this regard. It states that a victorious king should affirm prevalent traditions in a conquered territory. You can conquer the territory, get tribute or whatever, maybe punish a few people, but the prevalent traditions should all be maintained. And finally, we went all over the world, so I think we can justifiably come back to India. In Zafarnama, which is a letter written by Guru Gobind Singh Ji to Aurangzeb, he informs Aurangzeb that he himself is an idol breaker, and that is the reason he is fighting with the kings of Kangra, who are idol worship. Okay, so clearly Guru Gobind Singh Ji understood what was normative and in which context. At least Guru Gobind Singh had no doubts as to where iconoclasm is normative and where idol worship is normative. And finally, again, the absence of citations. The Bamiyan Buddhas were destroyed on February 26, 2001. Again, the Taliban put out a statement at that time, but they never mentioned that, again, this is our subcontinental or South Asian continuity that we are observing. No, they cited other precedents and other principles. And the entire reason Goelji had to go through all this trouble was probably because of the eminent historians. If they had not tried to change this 2,000-year-old consensus that prophetic monotheism essentially works for the elimination of both polytheism and idolatry, I mean, there's nothing to argue about this at all. And after all, even Goelji's own book is a compilation of everything that is there in other books and in Epigraphica Indica. So Goelji went far beyond that. And he said that the movement for the restoration of Hindu temples has got bogged down around the Rama Janmabhoomi at Ayodhya. He said that the more important question in his mind was why Hindu temples met the fate they did at the hands of Islamic invaders, which has not even been whispered. That is what he was really concerned about. One or two temples restoration is fine according to him, and in fact, he was the person who wrote the white paper on Ayodhya, and he wrote so many articles about Rama Janmabhoomi. So there is no question about his commitment to it. But he said that this is only a sidelight. And the more important question is, we should understand the theological basis of iconoclasm. And I finally conclude with what could well be a sort of memorial to Sri Sitaram Goelji on his centenary, because he once or twice, I think I learned from Dr. L's biography of Goelji that he was on the wrong side of the law and he was almost arrested. So we can say that Goelji was arrested not for spreading rumors, but for spreading facts. This was his fate. So with that, I can conclude my talk, and I would like to acknowledge, of course, Sri Ram Swarup and Sri Sitaram Goel. And without their ideas, I don't think we would be having this discussion, and so many things would not have come up. And of course, we have to remember the internet, which enabled the dissemination of their ideas. Mm-hmm. And of course, India Facts and Professor Ramesh Rao for organizing this conference on the centenary, which is very notable. And Dr. Conrad Elst for all his wonderful books that he has written, for his counsel, for his advice, for putting together this program and abstracts, papers, etc. And for Mr. B. Srinivas for taking care of the logistics in conducting this program. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope we are not too late.
No, Dr. Sitaraman, thank you for that very, very insightful and very fact-based session.